Turn to Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9. Mark 9. We'll begin in verse 14, going through verse 29. And when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them, and the scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" And someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." And he answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him. And when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood, and it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible for the one who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "This kind can be driven out. It cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." So this scene upon which Jesus and the three disciples stumble upon here is the complete opposite of that which they came from. If you remember that Jesus and these three disciples, Peter, James, and John, had just witnessed Jesus being transfigured on the mountain. That's where they're just coming from. They're coming down the mountain. And now they're coming down to a new scene that is altogether different from where they had just been. MacArthur, in his commentary on Mark, does a good job of comparing these two scenes. He says this, quote, "The transfiguration happened on a mountain. This happened in the valley below. In the transfiguration there was glory. Here there was suffering. In the transfiguration God dominated the scene. Here Satan did. In the transfiguration the heavenly Father was pleased. In this incident an earthly father was tormented. In the transfiguration there was a perfect son. Here there was a perverted son. At the transfiguration fallen men were in holy wonder. In this story there was a fallen son in unholy horror." So this scene is almost wholly different from the scene that they had just witnessed on the mountain. One was a future glimpse of heaven, and the other was a glimpse of hell, as it were. But one thing that is true of both of these scenes is that Peter and the other two disciples were witnesses of his majesty on the mountain. And when they came down from the mountain, the majesty of Christ was still seen in the valley. It will still be seen when he heals this epileptic. In other words, what these disciples clearly saw on the mountain was that Jesus is Lord of all. He's Lord of all things. They clearly saw that. And when they come down the mountain, that truth is still true. Jesus is still Lord of all as he's coming down to this valley. And so with that being said, let's take a look at the background of this text and what is happening. As I just said, Jesus is coming down the mountain, and when he arrives on the scene, he sees the lack of faith on his disciples' part. They're not able to cast out this demon. This should remind us of an Old Testament scene when Moses speaks with God through a mountain on Mount Sinai. And when he comes down the mountain, what does he witness when he comes down the mountain? He sees a faithless group of people worshiping a golden calf. And it's very similar because Jesus was just on a mountain speaking to God through the cloud. And now he's coming down the mountain, and what does he see? He sees a group of faithless men who cannot cast out a demon. But what is happening that is exposing the disciples' lack of faith? I just said it. The answer to this question comes from a distressed father in the crowd. He says this about his son. He says, "He has a spirit that makes him mute, and whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid." So judging from these signs, the young boy would have had a neurological disorder called epilepsy. But what made his condition worse was that not only was he an epileptic, he was also deaf. He couldn't hear, and he was mute. He couldn't speak. And this was not merely a neurological issue. The text says it was caused by an unclean spirit. So that's the boy's condition, and the disciples are not able to help him. They're not able to do anything for his situation. And Mark, more than any other gospel writer, more than Matthew and Luke combined, spends more time and gives more detail in telling this story, likely because Mark had as his source Peter the Apostle. But the fact that Mark gives more detail to this story, the fact that he spends more time in telling us this story, tells me that he considered this story important. And so with that being said, I think we should view this story as very important for us as well. So the way I want to break down this text is to break it into 6 parts, each part centered around one of the responses or declarations of Christ, and then provide the context for each of those responses. And I believe that there is much to be gained from this passage for 2 reasons. Number one is that it tells us who Christ is. It tells us what he's like. And the second thing is that it informs us on what is necessary for the Christian life. What's necessary for our walk with Christ. So with those 2 things in mind, let's go ahead and start with verse 14. Verse 14 says, "And when they came to the disciples," that is, the 9 disciples that were down below, "they saw a great crowd around them, and scribes arguing with them." So as they approach this scene, they see a very large crowd. Mark always uses the words, a great crowd. That's what he uses most of the time. And a group of scribes arguing with the 9 disciples. And precisely what they're arguing about with them is not explicitly stated, but based on the context here, they're probably rubbing in the fact that these disciples are not able to cast out this demon. That's probably what they're talking about. They're talking about how the disciples are not able to do something as simple as this. They're rubbing it in, as it were. But the moment that Jesus sees this, that his disciples are being cornered, he immediately comes to their aid, rather. And verse 15 says, "And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him." Now, some commentators here suggest that the reason the crowd was amazed when they saw him was the same reason why the crowd was amazed when they saw Moses coming down the mountain, because Moses' face was shining. So people say that the reason why they're amazed at Christ here is because his face was shining. But that's nowhere in the text in this passage. And not only that, but it would be going against what Jesus had said in verse 9, to keep what they saw as a secret. It would be going against that. And also in the case of Moses, the Israelites were afraid to approach Moses, whereas here the people are running up to Jesus. So that's not very clear that Jesus' face is shining. The cause of their amazement was therefore likely due to the fact that his presence evoked amazement. It evoked astonishment. People were happy whenever Christ came into their presence. People were amazed when he came to them. And so now as Jesus comes over to the aid of these 9 disciples, he directs his question not at the disciples saying, "What have you done now?" He doesn't say that. He directs his question rather to the scribes and says, What are you arguing about with them? He directs his question at the scribes. So first, one of the things I find interesting about this portion here is that the scribes are more than willing to take on the 9 disciples, more than willing to argue with them. But once Jesus shows up, they don't say another word in this passage. They have nothing to say at that point. None of them are willing to respond to him. And second, the thing I do want to point out about this question and about this portion is that Jesus is acting as the disciples' representative. He is their representative. I believe that's how Mark is portraying Christ here. He is the disciples' representative. The reason I think this is because of 2 reasons. Number one, rather than questioning the disciples, he turns the question on the scribes. What are you arguing about with them? Okay, that's the first reason. Number 2 is because of what the Father says in verse 17. Notice what he says. Teacher, I brought my son to you. But he brought his son to the disciples. It's interesting that whenever he brought him to the disciples, it was as if he was bringing them to Christ, right? Because he's seen as their representative. The disciples are viewed here as an extension of their master. Wherever he goes, they go. And whatever he does, typically, they do. And so therefore, when this man brought his son to the disciples, it was as if he was bringing him to Jesus, because they were seen as a mere extension of Jesus. They were one with him. And this is a truth that we find repeatedly in the New Testament, that Christ's people are one with him in a practical sense, but also in a theological sense. I'll explain that in just a second. Let me give a few examples of this. First would be Luke 10:16, where Jesus says this. He's speaking to the disciples. He says, "The one who hears you hears me, and the one that rejects you rejects me, and the one who rejects me rejects him who sent me." So rejecting the apostles' message is a rejection of Christ, because ultimately they represent their master. They are one with their master. If you reject the apostles' message, that is a rejection of Christ. Another example would be Matthew 25, verse 40. And the context here is the context of the final judgment, where Jesus separates the sheep from the goats. And this is what he says to his sheep, the ones that did kind deeds to the other sheep. He says, verse 40, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me." When the act of kindness is shown to one of Christ's disciples, and because they are one with Christ, it was an act that was done to Christ. And so there is actually a deep theological truth that is grounded in this, that we, by faith, are united to Christ. What does that mean, that we are united to Christ? It means this. It means all that belongs to us goes to Christ, and all that belongs to Christ comes to us. What does that look like? It looks like this. It looks like all of our sin being transferred to Christ. He became a curse for us. What does that mean for us? All of his righteousness, his right standing before God, is applied to us. That's what being united to Christ means. That's our union with Christ. We have his righteousness. And because of this union that Christ shares with his sheep, anything that happens to the sheep, whether it be good or bad, it is as if he shares in it. If the sheep rejoice, then Christ rejoices. If the sheep suffer, then Christ suffers. Not physically. It's as if his heart goes out to his people. He is emotionally suffering with his people. And we see this actually over and over. We see this when Jesus confronts Saul, the Apostle Paul, when he's on the road to Damascus. He says this, Acts 9, verse 4, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting them?" That's not what he says. "Why are you persecuting me?" Why are you persecuting me? The early Christians' experience of suffering through persecution was, in a sense, born and felt by Christ in heaven, because we are a part of the same body. We are the body, and he is the head. And we see something very similar whenever the Israelites are taken out of bondage in Egypt. We see this in Isaiah 63, verse 9, where this is true about God. It says, in all of their affliction, meaning their enslavement, all of that, in all of their affliction, he was afflicted. Everything that happened to them, everything that they felt, everything that they bore was felt by God because of his compassion to his people. And thus we see the truth of Christ as our representative here. When he arrives on the scene in this text, the disciples are seen as an extension of him. And thus when he comes on the scene, he comes to their aid and asks the scribes, what are you arguing about with them? I represent them. What are you talking about with these men? Now, if I were in Christ's shoes here and I saw these disciples, I would probably think to myself, oh geez, these guys, what are they doing again? I would almost be ashamed to own these men because of what they're doing. They're not able to cast out one little demon. And think about it. There's a lot of people standing around. They're making a fool of themselves in front of a lot of people. So it would be easy to think, geez, these guys, again. That's not what Christ does here. He's not afraid to own these men. Why is he not afraid to own these men as his own? The answer to that question comes back down to that question of union, that reality of union. Because I'm one with Christ, he's not afraid to own me. Hebrews 2:11 says, for he who sanctifies, meaning Jesus, and those who are sanctified are all one. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers. That's why he's not ashamed of these men. He's one with them in the sense that he's taken on flesh. He has the same flesh as us. And because he has the same flesh, he's able to sympathize with us on a closer level. As a man, he's able to sympathize with us as a man. He's sympathetic towards all our needs as he is with these disciples. They're being cornered by these scribes, and they have done that to him over and over and over again. But he's been able to handle them just like that. But not so with the disciples. And so he comes to their aid and helps them in their time of need. Thomas Houston, a 19th century theologian, once said that Christ is the elder brother of those that are adopted into God's family. And thus he regards his saints with the love of a brother's heart. He takes the tenderest interest in all their concerns, and he never ceases to do them good. And thus was the case when he came to the aid of these disciples. He is their representative. He is one with these men, and so he comes to their aid. But though this is true, this does not mean that Christ at times shows frustration with these disciples. And after he asks the scribes what they're arguing about with his disciples, a man from the crowd responds and tells him about the situation, how bad the condition of his son is, and how the disciples were not able to help him. And this leads to Christ's words in verse 19, where he says this, O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? So this frustration is not exclusively directed toward his disciples. It also includes the scribes. It also includes the Father and really all who stand around. And this is a frustration that stems from the fact that he's been with these men for so long, and yet they're still faithless. He's been with them for so long, and yet they still have a lack of faith. And you might think to yourself, after seeing this statement by Christ, oh, faithless generation, he's showing his frustration. You might think to yourself, well, then I'm perfectly justified to show my frustration when things don't go my way. I'm perfectly justified to explode when my kids are annoying me. I'm perfectly justified to be frustrated when my order gets wrong at Wendy's again. And that happens a lot if you haven't been to Wendy's. I am justified in being annoyed and being frustrated by these things. I just want to remind you of the fact, the context here, that Christ's frustration doesn't stem from an inconvenience. It doesn't stem from a minor annoyance on his part, but it stems from the people's lack of faith. That's where his annoyance stems from. His frustration is not concerned with trivial things, but with major things, things of salvation. It's a frustration with that generation and their lack of faith, as it is evidenced in their inability to help this boy. Let me just say this. It's the kind of frustration that we should have with our generation. It's the kind of frustration that we should have with our generation. Not because, listen to this, not because they don't share the exact same views as we do or vote the same way that we do, although those things can be frustrating, but because there is so little faith. That's why we should be frustrated. There is so little faith. And what I mean by faith is not in the abstract, subjective sense, right? You always hear the slogan, faith over fear. Every time I see that slogan, I always want to ask the question, faith in what? Faith in what? We have to be precise whenever we talk about putting our faith in something or someone. We are Christians. We should be precise in what we believe, what we put our faith in. So what I mean by faith is a faith that is firmly rooted in the Scriptures as God's inspired word and as Christ as both Lord of heaven and earth. In other words, the Christian faith. That's what we should defend. That's what we should be frustrated over. That was the frustration of Stephen whenever he was talking to the Jews, when he says this, Acts 7:51, "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit." That is a godly frustration. We need to be frustrated, but we need to be frustrated over the lack of faith in this world, in our culture. We need to be frustrated with the lack of Christian commitment, right? The lack of faith in our culture. It's a Christ-like frustration. And so after he shares his frustration, saying, "How long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you?" He then says, "Bring him here to me." And verse 20 then says, "And they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at his mouth." After this convulsion on the ground, this leads to Christ's investigation in verse 21, where he says, "How long has this been happening to him?" How long has this been happening to him? Most commentators say that Christ already knew the child's history. He only wanted the father of the child to tell him so that he could share in his pain. And that's a very plausible interpretation, but I also think that this could be an example of the incarnation. God becoming man, as Philippians 2 says. Philippians 2 says, "Though he was in the form of God," meaning omniscient, he has all the attributes of God, right? He's in the form of God, he's omniscient. "He did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men." Now this emptying that Paul is talking about does not mean that he emptied himself of his attributes like omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, but it does mean that he took upon himself a nature that was not omniscient, a nature that was not omnipotent, a nature that was not omnipresent. That's what makes the incarnation incredible. That's what makes it a mystery, is that within the one man of Christ Jesus, there exists two completely opposite natures, one that is all-knowing and one that is not all-knowing. And that's a mystery in our minds. How can this be? So when Christ comes to earth, there were times when he didn't know things. He didn't know the time of his return. He didn't know who touched his garment. He didn't know, he might not have known this child's past history. But yet he was still truly God in the flesh, and he was still truly man. Those things are a mystery to us, but this can be interpreted either way. But the Father responds to Christ's inquiry and says, he's been like this from childhood, and it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Now, before we get into the implications of this response and how Jesus responds to it, I want you to notice something about the Father and his urgent request on his Son's behalf. Notice how the Father identifies himself with his Son. Rather than saying, have compassion on him and help him. He says this, have compassion on us and help us. It's similar to what the Syrophoenician woman did in Matthew 15, whenever she's praying on her daughter's behalf to Jesus. She says, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon. Now the point is that the parents of the child saw their own well-being wrapped up in their child's well-being, and that's what made their request so urgent, especially since this is the way that his child had been ever since his childhood. He never heard his child speak. His child has never been able to hear him speak. And that's what makes his request so urgent. He's been like this. The demon has possessed him ever since he was a child. J.C. Ryle made a pointed application in this regard when he said, we must labor to do good to our children, even from their earliest years. If Satan begins so early to do them harm, we must not be behind him in diligence to lead them to God. If young hearts can be filled by Satan, they can also be filled with the Spirit of God. Those of us who are parents and grandparents, as you heard from the last message, we have the responsibility to teach our children, even from a young age. If they can be filled by Satan, they can be filled by the Spirit of God. We ought to have the same heart as this man did, pleading for our children, viewing them as one with ourselves. And so the father's response, which was mixed with doubt, if you remember his response, he said, if you can, talking to Jesus, it's mixed with doubt. This leads Jesus to respond in verse 23, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. All things are possible for one who believes. What Jesus says here is really the heart of the text. This is the heart of the text. That in order to access the power of God, faith is central. This was the lesson to all who stood by, the disciples, the Father, and even the scribes. And faith has been a central thing in Mark's gospel, that in order to access the power of God, in order to be healed, faith is central. We saw this in chapter 5. The woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, she comes and touches Christ's garment. And Christ says this to her, Mark 5:34, daughter, your faith has made you well. And on the other hand, it was the lack of faith on the people of Nazareth's part that kept them from being healed. You remember that in chapter 6, verse 5 and 6. And he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. Now, we'll see in just a moment how Jesus furthers this point of the necessity of faith in the Christian life with his disciples. But notice in the text what the Father says to Christ. He's right after Christ had just said, if you can, all things are possible for the one who believes. Verse 24, it says, immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. Those are some of our favorite words in Scripture because we can so easily sympathize with those words. Every Christian, okay, not just some Christians, every Christian has felt like that at some point. Every Christian. And perhaps some of you may be feeling that right now at this moment. But there is a spark of genuine faith within us, as I believe was true with this man, but there also exists a defect in our faith that causes us to believe not as we ought to. That's true of every Christian today. And because of this reality, that there exists within us a defect in our faith, that causes us to cry out to God. Why does it cause us to cry out to God? Because ultimately, faith is a gift from God. Faith is a gift from God. And not only that, but the increase of faith is a gift from God. And so you see that from this man. He cries out to God because he knows he's the one that can increase his faith. And that is a practical lesson for how to battle unbelief. How do we battle unbelief in our own life? When we see unbelief in the way that we act and what we believe? How do we battle with unbelief? The answer is we do what this man did. We go to God and we plead with him to help our unbelief and increase our faith. We plead with God to help us. That's what we do. But we shouldn't ask for the increase of faith all the while doing nothing on our part. Right? We're just sitting in a chair and we ask God, please increase my faith, and then we do nothing. That's not how that works. Sanctification and the increase of faith is a synergistic effort. Okay? The beginning of your salvation was a monergistic effort, right? God came into your life, he gripped your heart, and he drew you to himself. But after that, salvation, the process of sanctification is a synergistic effort. I work with God to increase my own faith. I think this is how the Apostle Paul puts it in Philippians 2. He says, work out your own salvation, and salvation there is not the beginning salvation, this is sanctification. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. He says, you do this. You work out your salvation with fear and trembling. But then he says this, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So yes, it's true. God wills and works within you for his good pleasure. He transforms you. But it's also true that you must work with him. You must work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And so that is how faith is increased. We ask for the increase of faith from God. See, he gives that. But we work with him in that process. But again, we'll see in just a moment what Jesus says about the importance of prayer and faith in regards to the disciples' lives. But now I want to look at Christ's domination in verse 25. Verse 25, it says, and when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. So what the disciples could not do because of their lack of faith, the master himself has no problem with. He has no problem with this. Christ shows his absolute dominance over the demonic realm by commanding the spirit to come out of the child, but also telling him to never enter him again. And verse 20 also hinted at this dominance over the spiritual realm. Whenever the spirit saw him, and it immediately convulsed the boy. As soon as he saw Jesus, it immediately convulsed him. Why was that the case? Why did the spirit immediately convulse the boy as soon as he locked eyes with who was coming to him? The answer to that is because he was terrified of the one that was coming to him. He was terrified of the one that was coming to him because that's the one that's going to judge him one day. That's the one that has control over him. That's the one that has dominion over him. He was terrified of Christ. And verses 26 and 27 then show what happened after Christ's command of the unclean spirit. It says, and after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. This was an absolute domination on the Lord's part. This was an absolute domination over all demons. And thinking about this for ourselves, what a wonderful truth this is to remind ourselves of. That Christ has absolute dominance over all demons. He has all power. It's a wonderful truth to remind ourselves, but it's also a great truth to tell our children who are afraid of these things. Right? Children are afraid of many things. They're afraid of things like this. And this is a wonderful truth to tell them when they're afraid. To be able to tell them that there is somebody that the demons are terrified of. The things that you're afraid of, they're afraid of something as well. They're afraid of Jesus. And Jesus is our protector. He is our brother. He is our friend. He is on our side. That's who we have on our side. He is the one, according to Ephesians 1:21, that has been seated at the right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but in the one to come. So, when your child wakes up in the middle of the night because they're afraid, we should tell them about the one that has all authority, the one that has all dominion, the one that has all power. That's who we should tell them about. And when our child wakes up because of a nightmare, we should remind them of the demon's nightmares. We should remind them that they have nightmares as well, and they have nightmares of the one that is on your side. They are afraid of Jesus. They're horribly afraid of the great shepherd of the sheep. So Jesus commands this unclean spirit to leave, and it had no choice but to leave and to never enter him again. It had no choice but to leave. And then finally, we come to the last part, when the disciples speak with Christ privately. They're in a room, we don't know what room, but they're speaking with him privately now. Verses 28 and 29 say, "And when he entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, 'Why could we not cast it out?' And he said to them, 'This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer.'" Matthew's gospel parallel says, "Because of your little faith," that's why you weren't able to cast it out. "Because of your little faith, for truly I say to you, if you have faith like a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." So this was an important lesson for the disciples, because at this point in their lives, they had grown to a point where they thought that they could do these duties on their own power. That's where they had come to. They thought that they could do this on their own initiative. And what he's teaching them here, what he's teaching them by telling them this, is that apart from him, they can do nothing. Apart from his power, they can do nothing. Apart from the reliance upon the power of God, which is accessed by faith-filled prayer, even if it's the size of a mustard seed, they can accomplish nothing apart from him. And that's true for the Christian life as well, that apart from a reliance upon his power and grace, we can do nothing. And so a wonderful prayer to pray at the beginning of the day, showing our reliance upon God, is to say, "God, please help me this very day. If you don't help me today, then nothing good will happen. Nothing good will happen." Having that sweet reliance upon God every single day. "God, please supply my needs for this day. Get me through this day. Strengthen me. Apart from you, I have nothing good." That's the kind of prayer that God expects of us. That's the kind of faith that God expects from us. A full reliance upon him for our needs. And so that's a central truth in this text, that the one who believes, that is the one who believes through the act of prayer, all things are possible, and to neglect this is to be deprived of all power in the Christian life. Let me say that again. To neglect this is to be deprived of all power in the Christian life. That faith-filled prayer and reliance upon God. And that is a major theme in this text. But as you notice in the title of the message, it is the centrality of faith and the majesty of God. And you might be thinking to yourself, where does the majesty of God come into play with this passage? Well, the answer to that actually comes from Luke's gospel, where after Jesus performs this miracle and casts out the demon, this is what the people are thinking. It says, "They were all astonished at the majesty of God." In other words, what just took place in this valley was a display of the majesty of God. Or to put it differently again, what these people just witnessed was the glory of God. Both majesty and glory can be interchangeably used like that. But to understand the full weight of what's being said here, I think it's necessary that we go back to the Old Testament, in particular to Isaiah 35. Isaiah 35, verse 2 says this concerning Zion: "They shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God." Right? You see how those two things are interchangeably used, majesty and glory. And we should ask ourselves, how are they going to see the majesty of God? What is that going to look like? 3 verses later in Isaiah, it says this: "Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy." That's how the majesty of God will be seen. The majesty of God was seen here when this little boy's ears were unstopped and he was able to hear for the first time. The majesty of God was seen when this little boy's mute tongue was able to sing for joy. That's where the majesty of God was seen in this text. And what's interesting is that Isaiah 53 describes the Messiah as having no form or majesty that we should look at him, because he is God clothed with flesh. He has no majesty that we should look at him. But the works that he did, like opening the eyes of the blind, opening the ears of the deaf, strengthening the legs of the lame, and loosening the tongues of the mute, displayed in a unique way the majesty and glory of God. It displayed the glory of God. And that's why John says, John 1:14, "And the Word became flesh, and we have seen his glory." What was part of that glory? What we just saw right there. They saw the majesty of God when they saw this event. They saw the glory of God when this little boy was healed. Just one more closing thought before we finish in relation to what I just said. Whenever we hear the words like glory or majesty, oftentimes when we hear those words, they feel like distant words, right? Sometimes they feel when they're directly applied to God, it can make us feel like we're very far from God. They are terms that speak of the transcendence, the holiness, and the complete otherness of God. When you hear the word majesty, those are things that we think of. For instance, what Peter, James, and John had just witnessed on the Mount of Transfiguration was that. They saw the majesty of God, the complete otherness of Christ. 2 Peter 1:16 says, Peter says, he was eyewitness of his majesty. And so when he was transfigured before them, he was wholly separate and wholly distinguished from them, like the sun is distinguished from a campfire. Wholly different. Those are the things that we think of when we hear the word majesty, glory. But what makes Christ's majesty so attractive to us and almost irresistible is that it's a majesty that stoops down. It's a majesty that condescends and comes down to our level. It's a majesty that comes down from a mountain of glory to enter a valley of death to give strong support to those in need. That's what makes the majesty of Christ so attractive to us. That though he is high, he has regard for the lowly. And that's what we see in this text today. Christ is coming down from this mountain of glory, and he comes down to a valley of death. And he helps this father. He helps this little boy who has never heard in his life, has never spoken in his life, and the majesty of God was seen. He's Lord of both the mountain and that valley. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you that Christ in his majesty stoops down to our level. He comes to us as his children. Father, he gives us faith. He strengthens us in our daily needs. And Father, I ask that we would rely more upon you and upon your power, Father. We would learn the lessons that you taught your disciples here, that apart from you, nothing good can be done. Apart from you, nothing can be done. So, Father, please apply that to our hearts. Apply that to our minds and help us to love you even more. We ask this in Jesus' name.